My name is Tori Grace Nichols. Most folks call me Grace, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. I broadly describe myself as a prismatic performance artist. I like to create in a lot of different ways. When I think about what I wish healthcare providers knew about me specifically, is that I'm adopted. That plays a major role in my whole life, and that complicates things around family medical history, and there's not a huge narrative around it, but it really impacts someone's experience in the world connected to their self-esteem, their identity, and that impacts all aspects of our life. Other than that, I think that broadly I'm a whole person, and I have a whole host of medical needs, not necessarily connected to my transness. So it's always helpful when there can be a bit more of a holistic or broader inquiry to my life experience before treating me for anything. I really love about myself that I'm a really curious and open person, that I'm a really creative person, and that I have a really interesting life story. And that serves me really well, especially in my creativity. I was born in the Philippines and was adopted when I was 7 months old, and I grew up overseas on military bases, and the earth is blessing us with this leaf. And I've had a really interesting experience figuring out all of my identities. If I were to think about my identity development in categories, I would say I sort of figured out my sexuality, disability, gender identity, and race was actually kind of in the middle, since I grew up internationally and in a white family. It's been a journey to figure out where I fit in culturally. And that can be a struggle sometimes, for sure, as far as like placing myself in a context anywhere, context such as a community, the United States, and it could, while finding a way to fit in can be a challenge, it makes me a really unique person a lot of times. And I also love about myself that I am really community oriented, and almost everything I do is in service of connection and community. Health and wellness to me is really looking at as people, as individuals, and knowing that there are a bazillion different factors that can play into someone's well-being. So for me, that has a lot to do with my mental health and my spirituality, and then connected to more activist organizing work, it also has to do with having a power analysis about how the world is set up, because that infiltrates every aspect of our life, including healthcare. So if I see a healthcare practitioner and they don't have a great race or class, disability, gender analysis, and they treat me in a way that stereotypes me, that doesn't look at me as a whole person, then I probably am not going to get, I'm probably not going to have the greatest experience with that healthcare provider. So for me, I really appreciate when healthcare providers ask me about myself and the things that are important to me. As an adopted person, I have felt really disconnected from my birth culture, from people who look like me, from my own family. And if healthcare practitioners can take that into consideration, to think about how that type of disconnect has had an impact on my life, then that should inform them about other things that might be happening with me. And so health and wellness is also I guess continuing with this adopted theme, health and wellness is also a sense of belonging, of a sense of being seen and affirmed by people who are providing care for you, in every sense of the word. We should be building out our communities with care at its center, for each other. And so it doesn't have to be just a healthcare provider, but it's how are we taking care of one another in community? How are we getting connected within our different identity groups and otherwise? I suppose another thing I would want healthcare providers to know about me specifically is that I identify as non-binary and genderqueer. And so I've been on T for about 3 years or so, and my body is, and the way that I'm presenting is becoming increasingly masculine, but I don't identify that way. That a lot of times these concepts of sex and gender are placed on people. So, for example, my voice, it's becoming increasingly low, but I'm not trying to sound like a man. I have no desire to sound like a man. It's more so how my voice is changing, and I've sought support to make sure that my voice is healthy as it changes, without any goal to a specific type of gender. That might be other people's goals, but that's not mine. So again, I think it's really important that that we're asked kind of what I think it's really important that we're asked what are our health goals, and whether they're connected to gender or not. As an adopted person, I've found a lot of joy with other adoptees who have a shared experience. There's a bit of gymnastics I think that adoptees have to do, and I think people in general who have difficult traumatic experiences, which is finding a way to work with your difficult experiences. I never want to say adoptees often get dismissed when they express hurt or pain around their experiences, and a common response we get is everything happens for a reason, combined with aren't you grateful that you were saved from whatever type of experience. And that might be true for some adoptees, but the reality is that we adoption is always trauma in the ways that, someone is taken away from a parent, even if the circumstances wasn't great. And the joy I've been able to find is finding my own purpose and ownership in my own life experience. It's hard for adoptees to feel that when we feel like everything's been taken away from us. And in many instances, that's true. And I think all of us have to make decisions at some point of how are we going to live our lives moving forward, and reclaiming our own stories, adoption being a part of the story, and then everything beyond our adoption experience are also a part of our stories. And like I said, I will never be dismissive or kind of give into that trope of things happening for a reason. And like, I've had such rich life experiences that if I were to spend my life just being mad about being adopted, I would miss out on so much. And so I'm really excited about continuing to transform my experience and make people aware of all the complications. I really want to complicate adoption narratives. The narrative that is not accepted or that people don't want to acknowledge is adoption as trauma. And so if people aren't having trauma-informed healthcare practices, and even if they do, if they don't consider adoption trauma, then that's another area that, or another factor that might lead to someone not getting great health care because someone's not acknowledging their full experience. Something that has not been said throughout this whole pandemic is creatives, performers as frontline workers, as people who, what were we doing all day during the pandemic? Like watching Netflix, or finding music to listen to, or tuning into online drag shows. These creatives sit on the front lines of getting people through the day. And I think creative work can also serve a really strong purpose of political education, education around history, and thwarting isolation. A lot of creatives identify as storytellers because when we can share our experiences, then other people know that they're not so alone. And that feels pretty central to my work as far as creating things that kind of raise our collective consciousness of our human experience. And the core of that being not feeling alone. When people have a difficult experience in isolation, that automatically makes recovery of that experience a bazillion times harder. But if we know that someone has had that shared experience, there's a community of support, there are healthcare providers that are informed and willing to acknowledge difficult experiences, then the chance of recovery, of transformation of something difficult is through the roof. So, right, wellness isn't just about physically what's happening with us, although that is usually the manifestation of feeling alone, of feeling anxious, of having a difficult experience. But it's so much more broad than that. Trans wellness is wholeness. Trans wellness is community care. Trans wellness is consent. Trans wellness is asking us about our lives. Trans wellness is self-determination. I'm like, how do we tell healthcare practitioners to question everything? To question the education they received? Did it come from a white supremacist place that has flat ideas about gender and sexuality? How do we shift away from only a white Western approach to healthcare? What's really important for healthcare practitioners to know is that trans people have existed since the beginning of time. And we've been out here living our lives with lots of different names in lots of different communities. And we're not a new or trendy phenomenon that needs to be treated or fixed. We are people with an ancient legacy of existence, and we know what's best for our bodies and our experience. So in healthcare learnings, in healthcare education, I hope that there can be more information around the history of trans people. I hope that healthcare education can be more accessible to trans people, because I always feel a lot more comfortable when my healthcare provider is also trans and can relate and connect to my experience. I've recently been learning Kali, which is a martial art form, and it's taught in a way that can be used with a weapon or not, and it can be used with sticks, with swords, or just your hand. It's one of the most taught martial art practices around the world because of its effectiveness, and its origins come from the Philippines. And I have been learning sort of the basic combat moves, but through a practitioner that also offers a lot of embodiment and meditative practices while we're learning. There's a really wonderful reframe around self-defense. So it's not self-defense, it's community preparedness, which is how this martial art form was used in indigenous communities in the Philippines. Actually, every family had their own fighting style. And when the Philippines was colonized, this martial art form was banned, and it was hidden in dance. So we used bamboo sticks, which is used a lot in Filipino dance as well, and hidden and kept secret in a lot of different ways because we were not allowed to defend ourselves. So the guidance I've got is like, now we get to do that. Lots of our people have died, lots of our trans people, lots of our healers have died who in lots of indigenous communities were trans people, people with access to more expansive experience. So in learning Kali, I'm really getting to reconnect with my Filipino culture, with with my spiritual practices, my community connection practices, and the Kali practice, again, really is about being prepared. It's about acting out of a place of knowledge, about knowing yourself and your body. So I was saying it's about knowing who's with you and who's on your side, and acting in a way that is informed and present, and not out of fear. It's not reactionary. It's a ancient practice that says we have enough and we are enough, and we just have to build together.